Hello and good evening to everybody. I hope that you have managed to find the invite okay. We saw the waiting room fill up with lots of people, so it's very exciting. I'm delighted to be joining you and talking about Renters' Rights Act. So if you're here for anything else, you've got the wrong waiting room or you've got the wrong webinar. My name's Tom Kite, and I'm one of the partners here at Comfort Estates. Tonight, I'll be joined by colleagues Sophie, Hannah, and Phil, who will be sharing and you'll be hearing from later this evening. Just a couple of points of housekeeping, and then we can get things going. So the webinar is being recorded, and a version of it will be made available to anybody who wants a copy of it later on this week. In terms of the format tonight, we're going to be hearing from Sophie, who is going to be taking us through the main changes and the overview of the Renters' Rights Act and what it means for us as landlords. And then we'll be having sharing some thoughts and our thoughts about what things do we need to do as landlords? How can we be ready to tackle the changes? And then at the end of the session, we should, and we're hoping to spend a little bit of time with some live Q&A. So this will be an opportunity for you to get any questions that you might have over to us. And we are going to hopefully answer as many of those as we can. Hannah will be moderating the Q&A and monitoring any questions that come in over the course of the evening. And we'll do our very best to get through those. So we've got lots to get through. We're hoping to wrap up by 8 o'clock. And so, yeah, without further ado, I'm going to hand over Sophie to you at this point to introduce yourself and take us through your presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tom. All right. I'm just going to open the screen. Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. As Tom said, my name is Sophie. I'm one of the partners here at Comfort Estates. Today's session is designed to give landlords a clear and practical understanding of the Renters' Rights Act, which is due to come into force on the 1st of May 2026. This is one of the most significant changes to the private rented sector in decades, and it will affect how tenancies are structured, how possession works, how rents are increased, and how landlords manage property day to day. Today isn't just about politics or headlines. It's about what these changes mean commercially and practically for landlords. So, as Tom's already said, we'll finish with some questions. So do pop them in once we open the Q&A later. Bear with me one moment. Okay, so just a bit about us to start with. So Comfort Estates are a residential sales, lettings and property management company. We support clients across the full property life cycle, whether that's buying, selling, letting or ongoing management. We are an ALA Property Mark licensed agency, and staying current with legislation is a key part of what we do. Our role is to help landlords stay compliant, reduce risk and make informed decisions as the market evolves. So why does this matter? On to the Renters' Rights Act. The current Assured Shorthold Tenancy Agreement, so AST for short, structure has been around since 1989, and this is coming to an end. As you can see, why we want to discuss the replacement. For those of you, excuse me, for those of you who pay close attention to the lettings legislation, you'll recall this legislation was first proposed under the Conservative government as a response to a growing sense of imbalance that existed between landlord and tenant. The proposed legislation was called the Renters' Right Bill, but it never passed into law. Once Labour came into power, this was picked back up and kept mostly the same, but renamed as the Renters' Right Act. The legislation has gained royal assent and will be passed into law on the 1st of May. So why is this important? This legislation matters because it reshapes the private rented sector in a number of major ways. Section 21 is being abolished, assured shorthold tenancies are ending, rent increases are changing, enforcement powers are increasing, and the overall direction of travel is towards a more regulated and evidence-based market. The key message is this: the market is moving from possession-led to compliance-led. Landlords who prepare early are usually the ones who adapt best. When does it start? So the Act is coming into force on the 1st of May 2026. Some of these changes will begin immediately, and these are the ones we'll spend the most time discussing today. Others are likely to be phased in over time through secondary legislation and transitional rules. We will touch on some of these later in the presentation. So this is not a single switch being flicked overnight, but the important point is landlords should be preparing now rather than waiting for implementation day. So that's great news that you're on the webinar just doing that now. So section 21, possession. One of the headline changes is the abolition. Sorry, we have an ongoing joke with me saying abolition of section 21. These have been referred to as a non-fault evictions in the media. This means landlords will no longer be able to regain possession without giving a legal reason. Instead, possession will need to be based on specific legal grounds under Section 8. For those of you who have served or are familiar with the Section 21 notice, you do not need to state a ground for possession, often why they have been referred to as a non-fault eviction. This is a major structural shift. If landlords are considering using Section 21 under the current system, your opportunity to do so ends in 9 days' time on the 30th of April. So you have 9 days left to issue any Section 21 notice. Section 8 becomes the main route for possession. And a quick reminder about Section 8. This is not new. It has just been updated to accommodate some new grounds for possession. For anyone who has had to evict a tenant for 2 months of arrears, you will have used a Section 8 as a statutory mechanism for doing so. So this expanded notice is now the only route for possession. And as such, landlords will need to rely on specific grounds such as rent arrears, antisocial behaviour, intention to sell, landlord or family moving in, major redevelopment or works. Practically, you'll need to show that one of these grounds exists. So that there are rent arrears or that you wish to sell the property, and then serve the correct notice on the tenant to regain possession. This is the key difference. Under Section 21, you did not need to prove that any ground for possession existed. Under Section 8, you need to be prepared to demonstrate that the relevant ground does exist. Each ground has a different notice period and evidential requirements. Possession has become less administrative and more evidence-driven, so you'll need to show the ground genuinely applies. So some grounds will have tighter controls. It is inevitable that since something like the Section 21 is removed, there will be someone who tries to manipulate the new requirements. As such, some of the grounds, especially the new ones, will have tighter control to prevent landlords from using them as a backdoor Section 21. For example, if relying on selling or moving, there are restrictions on reletting shortly afterwards. So, for example, if you serve notice on a tenant under a Section 8, Ground 1, you want to move back into the house, the tenant leaves, you will not be able to relet the property commercially for the next 12 months. The idea is that it will prevent landlords from serving this type of notice only to remarket the property 2 weeks later for a higher rent. You'll note that I said the law prevents commercial letting. These restrictions don't just apply to residential letting. You would not be able to Airbnb or undertake a commercial letting agreement either in the preceding 12 months. For rent arrears, the threshold has been increased from 2 months to 3 months, so it's important more than ever to rely on additional discretionary grounds 10 and 11 in addition to grounds 8 for rent arrears. So landlords need to manage the arrears earlier and more proactively, and this is always our best advice. So we're going to move on to Section 2, rent. So rent increases will become more structured. Typically, increases will be limited to once per year and must follow the formal Section 13 process. Tenants will have a right to challenge increases if they believe the proposed rents exceed market level. The intention is to stop rent increases being used as an indirect way to remove tenants or apply pressure. Instead, rent setting must be commercially justifiable. Rents can only be set by undertaking a Section 13 process. In the past, rent increases could happen via a number of different routes. It could happen on the signing of a fixed term, via a contractual term in the tenancy, by mutual agreement, or via Section 13. Landlords have had more levers to achieve rent increases and didn't need to be strategic in their planning when coming to make changes to rents. This has now changed, and rent increases need to be thought of as more of a compliance item, like renewing a gas certificate if they want to make sure it's kept up to date. Practically, a Section 13 notice is a written document that notifies a tenant of a change to their rent. It needs serving at least 2 months prior to the increase date and cannot start any sooner than 12 months from the initial start date of the tenancy or the last increase. So just to confirm, you need to give at least 2 months notice, and there needs to be a period of 12 months from either the start of the initial date of the tenancy or when the last rent increase was done. All being well, hopefully the tenants update their standing orders, pay their new rent at the start date. However, there is a possibility for tenants to challenge a Section 13 notice, which we will discuss in the next slide. So, if a rent increase is challenged, the tribunal is likely to look at market evidence. That means comparable local properties, condition of the property, size and layout, location, and general market demand. So this is not about emotion or opinion. A city centre flat may be easy to compare. A unique farmhouse in the countryside may be much harder, which means evidence quality matters. So some practical steps. Make sure your evidence gathering is done in advance. Make sure it's done in each and every Section 13. Make sure you are up to date with inspections and have a good handle on the condition of the property. Rent tribunals can visit if they wish, so it's important that the rent increases are based on facts and not what your house looked like 10 years ago. Now, there is some good news, perhaps. It will cost the tenant not only the time to prepare a submission, but also £47 to refer a Section 13 to a rent tribunal. This is a very recent but important clarification. It should reduce the instances of tenants referring every rent increase to a tribunal, so gaming the system where they think they've got nothing to lose, unless they think they have a reasonable ground to do so. It will certainly not stop all of them, but it will likely deter some people. So let's move on to Section 3, tenancies. So ASDs, so short hold tenancies, will be replaced by APTs, assured periodic tenancies. You may hear us reference APTs later on, and this is what we mean. Existing fixed-term tenancies will convert to periodic tenancies on the 1st of May 2026. You will need to ensure that the government information sheet on all of your tenancies that set out the changes that are coming. That means tenancies run continuously rather than ending at a fixed point. For tenants, they will be required to give 2 payment periods of notice, which is a minimum of 2 months if they give notice in line with their payments. For landlord's notice, it is now in line with the relevant grounds that you are relying on for Section 8. So if a tenant gives notice on the 2nd of the month and they pay their rent on the 1st of the month, they would effectively be given 3 months notice because the notice needs to be given in line with when their rent is due, 1st of month being this case. So for landlords, it removes reliance on a fixed term expiry, and this being something that can be used in a negotiation. Possession will now depend on legal grounds rather than simply waiting for a term to end or being able to rely on a Section 21 notice. Student lets. So student lettings do remain within the scope of the reforms. This means that the changes will impact student lettings as well as other residential lettings. There is, however, an exception for larger buildings whose planning use class is PBSA, so purpose-built student accommodation. However, for most, this won't apply. There are special provisions designed to reflect the academic cycles, and there is a possession route. So what this means practically is you will need to notify students in advance of signing of the tenancy that you indeed to serve notice to recover possession of the property at the end of the academic year. This allows you to issue 4 months notice to the tenants to allow you to let on the academic cycle. The property must meet relevant criteria, so be a 3-bed or more. It will not convert those who might rent a smaller 2-bedroom properties to their students. So if you have a 2-bedroom property that is rented to students, unfortunately, that's not covered. It has to be 3 bedrooms or more to fall within this scope. The tenants can still issue their notice at any time, being 2 payment periods, and your notice could trigger a counter notice. One tenant can also give notice to end the whole joint tenancy. So this means landlords will need to be less bullish about dealing with a tenant in shared groups that want to leave. As you can see, there is a lot to consider and certainly no one-size-fits-all approach. Section 4, lettings process. So the lettings process itself is also changing. Rental bidding above advertised rent has been banned. Unlike in the past, or as happens with property sales, you cannot ask for best and final offers. In the event that there is multiple parties interested, landlords or agent are not allowed to solicit offers. Restriction on rent in advance are also being introduced. Understandably, you cannot request 6 or 12 months of rent in advance in effect the tenancy is in advance if in effect the tenancy is only for 1 month long at any time. And blanket bans such as refusing applicants simply because they receive benefits or have children are to be unlawful. It will be important, therefore, to make sure that you are careful of the rent setting phase and not underrent or underestimate the demand on your property. Once you have set an advertised rent, you cannot accept more. The direction is towards a more transparent application process. Pets. Tenants will have the right to request permission for pets. Landlords must not unreasonably refuse the key. Landlords must not unreasonably refuse. The key word here is unreasonably. If you want to refuse a request, you must have a reasonable reason to do so. Not liking pets in general sense is not a good enough reason. That means decisions should be based on genuine reasons. For example, a large dog in a very small flat may be a reasonable refusal, or a cat or a dog in a shared house where rooms are rented individually may also be a reasonable refusal. What has not changed is your ability to hold the tenant to account in returning the property to the same standard as it was given to them. If it did not have pet hair on the carpet when they moved in, you can reasonably expect to return the standard to the same standard or justify the cost of putting it right at the end if required. A blanket no pets ever policy will be harder than ever to justify. A key point here is decisions need to be reasoning rather than preference. Section 5, enforcement. So enforcement is also increasing significantly. Local authorities are to receive stronger powers, larger penalties, and wider investigation tools. Rent repayment orders are being expanded. Crucially, this will now mean that directors of limited companies will now face personal liability for rent repayment orders, where previously have been sheltered by their corporate structure. Councils may also retain proceeds from fines, increasing enforcement incentives. As with any significant legislative updates, it will of course come with new enforcement powers to ensure that legislation is being adhered to. So, what is the good news? Clearly, there will be compliance. Clearly, where the compliance becomes more difficult, there will be landlords who decide to sell up and leave the market. There is evidence that this is starting to happen. This therefore creates the likelihood of increased demand and competition. For those who are able to absorb and manage the new requirements, remaining part of a smaller and professional market should be continued to be beneficial. Section 6, future reforms. This Act is only part of a wider regulatory direction, and we know that there are other changes either being delivered through the Renters' Rights Act or outside that are coming and due to impact our industry. We expect that further measures such as the PRS database, landlords will be required to be registered. This already happens in part through licensing, which in Nottingham we are very used to. However, the PRS database will be rolled out the UK-wide as we understand. There'll be a landlord ombudsman, a body set up to deal with disputes or issues that arise between landlord and tenant. EPC reforms. So the government have announced that EPC rating of C will be required by 2030. So we'll see if that happens. Decent home standards, further legislation to deal with minimum standards and ongoing tax digitalisation. So this is a pattern of changes that are queued up and coming towards us quickly. There is a clear desire to continue to professionalise the landlord body. So section 7, what to do now?
Great. I think, this is the point where I'm going to jump in. Sophie, first of all, just to say thank you for taking us through all of that. Absolutely tons of information. And in addition to making the webinar itself available to you online, we will also make a set of the slides available as well. So for anybody who wants to have a look through those or get a copy of those will be available to everybody as well. I think the Q&A is open at this point, and we're going to start working our way through questions. Hannah will be working hard to maybe answer some questions in the chat and also store up some questions to start that we'll put to people later on. But I thought just in this point we will just go through some of the sort of practical next steps. We've called it a landlord action plan. So to perhaps have a think about, well, with all of the changes that are happening, what should I do about it? What things would be sensible for me to do so I'm not caught out by what's happening. Obviously, the first thing that you're doing, which is excellent, is you're already part of this webinar, and you're already thinking about, well, how do I sort of solve some of this stuff, and where do I get some advice? So hopefully, yeah, you're starting in the right place. Yeah, so in no particular order, I'll just sort of tackle some of the points as we've put up, that you'll be able to see on the presentation. Section 21, as Sophie mentioned, and the reason I start with it, just because it is the most pressing, the most pressing thing that actually needs to happen if you do want to do something about it. There will be some people for whom you've been on the fence about, do I serve a Section 21? Do I actually need to regain possession of the property? Do I want to sell it? It might be that you've owned it for a long time. It might be that you want to sell it with vacant possession. And actually, thinking about the changes that are coming, this is actually falling in line with your plan, and taking some action now might be the right thing to do. It might be that you've got student academic tenancies that are ending in the summer, and you need to think pretty carefully about the end of the period of time when the property was due, when you were due to end your fixed term. Do you need to serve a Section 21 notice, or do you need to be relying on your new Section 8 ground 4A to serve notice post the renters' rights implementation on the 1st of May. So having a look at your current tenancies and having an understanding of what you have and what you might need to do given that impending deadline, that is probably the most important thing that you can do, and action you can take right at this moment in time. In terms of some of the other things that you need to do, Sophie spoke about the change that's happening. So ASTs all become APTs on the 1st of May. And practically what that means is tenancies that were fixed terms, you might have signed a 12-month tenancy at the start of the year. On the 1st of May, it becomes effectively like a 1-month tenancy that then will roll indefinitely until someone ends it, either the tenant gives notice or the landlord gives notice. And you are required as a landlord to serve the government information sheet by the 31st of May. Is that right, Phil? Can you nod along? I don't need you to interject, but that is right. I think that's what we've put up at least. So you've got until the 31st of May to serve that government information sheet to your tenants, and they are required to have it by law. There is, in Sophie's slide, as she referred back to, there is a £7,000 fine that you can be charged in the event that you don't serve it. So this is something that is important to do, and all of your tenants need to have it. And if you've got joint tenants and they've got different email addresses, they each need to get a copy of it. And if you've got joint tenants who share an email address, you need to send it twice. So making sure that you have issued your government information sheets is an important thing to do. Thinking, potentially slightly more long term, but I guess medium term, not sort of necessarily sort of urgent things you need to think about. Clearly understanding the new Section 8 grounds. Sophie's given us, I think, a really good overview. And as she said, Section 8 is not a new thing. It has been around for a long time, and it has been a route for possession that landlords have had the ability to use for dealing with things like antisocial behaviour or rent arrears for regaining possession. Given that is now your only route for possession, so that is the only way that you can bring the tenancy to an end, having a good understanding of what that Section 8 is, even going and reading it and reading the grounds and just understanding how it works, is clearly an important thing, because it's now the dominant feature of how tenancies will end, whether the notice served by tenants or certainly in the event that the landlord needs to serve notice. So I think that's obviously a really important thing. The next thing probably that's really important to consider, and we certainly get, over the years, we've had lots and lots of landlords who come to us, and this is often one of the complaints they might have about either, trying to do rents by themselves or having another agent sort of doing rents. They might come to us and say, how much is the house worth? And we might give them the price, and they say, oh, well, that's really annoying because we've only rented out for half that and it's not changed in 10 years. And so given that now the other mechanisms for changing the rent, so offering a new tenancy and things like this, given that they now no longer exist, and the only mechanism for increasing rent is via a statutory notice, so serving a Section 13 notice, and given that this can only be done once a year, thinking about how do I align rents and how do I make sure that they're roughly at the market level of rent, is something that just now needs to be in landlord psyche, I think, more than it is, because as Sophie alluded to, rents often come up in discussion and are often reviewed by simply when there is a tenant changeover, or maybe you offer the tenants a new fixed term and you say, well, look, if you sign up for a new 12 months, we'll give you the rent for this price and things like that. Given that those now no longer happen, having the rents aligned and thinking about when that happens and making sure that that is happening, because it doesn't happen by itself, it's something you're going to have to do, or your agent is going to have to do for you, is an important thing. Checking your compliance documents. Now, on the one hand, you shouldn't be checking the compliance documents to make sure that you are have a defensible position in the event that you're in a possession hearing in court. You obviously should have your compliance documents up to date and correct, because that's your legal requirements as landlords. But even assuming that you've done the right things, it's important to make sure that everything is up to date, everything is in order, because clearly if you end up in a possession hearing, if you end up with a rent tribunal even, they will want to ensure that you have done your bit and you are compliant before hearing a possession hearing and things like that. There are reasons, there's if you're not up to date with compliance documents that should be up to date, then it may well be a reason that a possession hearing is not awarded in your favour. So clearly having a good handle and making sure that that's on top of, which I know is probably harder than it has been before. So is definitely something you need to be on top of. And of course, it would be silly of me if I didn't also mention professional management. If you currently do all of this yourself, which more landlords in the UK do than don't, so you're in the majority if that's the case. But certainly make sure that you have, maybe a registration to the NRLA, that you might have some software that helps you with the dates, about when your certificates need renewing. You need to stay up to date. And of course, the alternative to that is considering, do I actually engage for this element? Do I engage a professional management company? And if you go down that route, then certainly we would recommend that, wherever you're based in the country, that you seek out your ALA Property Mark local agent, who will be a local expert, but also someone who has self-signed up to undertake professional training. Their staff will be qualified. They will be audited to make sure that their financial compliance is correct, and many, many other things as well. So just certainly an option that is potentially worth considering. So I think we're going to move on to our next slide and perhaps just give you a sense of, what do we think the future looks like? And I'm going to hand over to Phil to take us through some of those ideas.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tom. I can already see some interesting questions come through, but I will reserve those for the Q&A. Some of what I talk about now overlaps with some of those questions, but we will get on to answering those. So thank you for them. If you haven't put a question, but you do have one, if you look for the Q&A symbol at the bottom, you should be able to click that and type your question in there, and Hannah will pick it up. Overall, though, our expectation or our view here is that well-run properties will continue to do very, very well. And that's really because we do expect some properties to be sold off as a consequence of this. Some landlords will find that this is maybe easier to get out of the market. This is time to reduce the burden, and maybe that becomes a property that goes from the private renter sector to the owner-occupied sector. So for those people who stay the course, that actually there are people who do want to stay in property long-term. And the vast majority of relationships we expect to remain the same. People want a nice home to live in. Landlords want to provide a nice home to live in, and that a reasonable market rate of rent will be shared as a consequence of that. So good stock in good locations remains attractive. Now, we do expect that actually the rent review process, as Tom's already touched on, the Section 13 process may, in effect, just sharpen up people's ability to make sure they're doing that on a regular basis. We do actually think a regular rent review is good for tenants as well. If you imagine a case where you haven't been putting your rent up and the tenant needs to move on, or you need them to move on for some reason, you issue them notice. If their rent is well below the market rate of rent, then there's very little reason why they will move out on a timely basis. So actually timely rent increases on a 12-monthly basis is really positive. Touching on students, some of the questions that are coming in are relevant to students. So our view here is generally students would move in anytime over the summer. So typically anytime in July, August or September. We expect that landlords' response to the renters' rights bill will mean that it will be in landlords' interest to start that tenancy as early as possible. The reason for that is a tenant can give notice at any time to end the tenancy. And typically the summer period, well, not typically, but just more generally, the academic year is 9 months long. The full calendar year is 12 months long. So a tenant's motivation might be to keep the contract as short as possible. What that means is their academic year finishes early summer, and we therefore expect tenancies to start lining up with that early summer. And as a consequence, a proactive move is to move the start date to early summer. We've already, landlords under our management have already had that happening. We, in fact, moved all of our move-in dates forward 3 weeks for contracts that we've been organising. It does mean that voids may increase on student property, and there's some questions come in which we'll specifically answer, but ultimately tenants can give notice at any time. So the loss of the fixed term contract for student houses is interesting in the sense that as a landlord, we are going to have to be open to those instances where a student falls out of university for whatever reason, and therefore no longer requires their accommodation and now has the right to give notice on behalf of the whole tenancy to end that tenancy. The important point here is how we react to that and what do you do in that instance. And given some of the questions that have come in, we'll cover off some of that in a second. And looking a bit further forward with the EPC legislation, it does look like properties with poor energy performance are more likely to be sold. So I was at the Arla Property Market Conference today down in Leicester, getting the very best information to hopefully bring you. One of the statistics that was actually interesting from today is that currently in the UK, the average number of properties in the private renter sector that meet EPCC is 44%. It means that 56% of the private renter sector needs to do something to their property in order to get it up to scratch for 2030 if that was to be rolled out for that date. Plenty of people will choose, rather than investing or reinvesting, should we say, in the property to get it more energy efficient, that it might be more likely they sell. If that does happen, I'll reiterate the first point that I made on the slide, which is that well-run properties will continue to do well, especially in a shrinking market. So, and on that, we'll go over to Hannah on our questions.
Yeah, and just before we jump in with Q&A, and it's been really interesting to see some of the questions that have been coming in, and thanks for typing those. If you haven't got a question in and you've got anything you want answering, do ask away. Phil, were there any bits from any notes that you took from anything that Sophie presented earlier that you wanted to add any colour to, given your recent trip today, or was there nothing further to add at this stage?
Very technical points. The information sheet that we've talked about sharing, and we've said that it can be done over email. That is correct if you have the specific agreement of the tenant that they will receive notices from you by email to that email address. So there may be some people out there that they've never had an agreement with their tenant that they could issue a notice via email, at which point they need to post that information sheet rather than send it via email. If you are a Comfort managed landlord, we have the email address within the tenancy agreement itself specifically named to issue notices to. So we will be able to serve those notices to the tenants via email. And there is a question on this which given I'm here, I may as well answer. Yes, if you are a managed landlord of ours, we will be doing that job. We will be emailing the tenants to make sure they have that information sheet by the 31st of May. And that does cover you as a landlord if we have done that for you. So that's hopefully answers that question early.
And Phil, just on this point that you mentioned about if you've got the email or the specific agreement of the tenant within the tenancy, for people who are going away going, well, I'm not really sure whether I do or not. Am I right in thinking that almost in most tenancy agreement templates, obviously you can't talk for everyone, usually there's a part underneath sort of obligations of landlords and tenants, there's a bit later on down the bottom that talks about the service of notices, and it usually will define how notices can be served between landlord and tenant. And in the event that, it might be that that's where the email address is, and in the event that it's absent, it might say you serve notice at, service of notices must be done at the property address or something like that. That's where you would clarify, presumably, if you were not sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's really useful clarification.
Fab. Right. Now, Hannah, we're going to come over to you if that's okay.
Yeah.
And I know that you are live and online. We had a small technical hitch earlier, which meant that Hannah can't be joining us by video, but you are, we believe, a real person and have been
I'm
looking
in the
through the
room.
questions. Fantastic.
Yeah, we've had quite a few questions specifically around student notices. So could you talk more specifically on student notice periods? So for example, can one student give notice on behalf of the whole group so that they would then all need to leave?
Yes, so this is the case where students have signed what we call a joint and several tenancy. I just believe, Hannah, if you can just mute yourself, I might change our screen over.
Yeah.
Not that everybody would want to look at me necessarily, but there we go. You are, so hello. Yeah, student tenancies is certainly in Nottingham. Most of the various properties that we rent out, we rent on what's called a joint and several tenancy agreement. There have been significant benefits to doing that in the sense that everybody is liable for the rent. That was one of the main reasons why people signed that. There were other reasons why it was done. Generally, groups of students would come together and expect to kind of rent a property together, so they were signed up as a group. The new legislation is very, very clear. There is no ambiguity. If you have 5 people in a house and one person decides to give notice, it will end that tenancy. So that tenancy is then on a 2-month notice. Now, the notice is actually 2 rental periods. So we say 2 months, but it technically means 2 rental periods, which broadly means anywhere between 2 and 3 months. So the moment that you get that from a tenant, and it could be any one of them, and they may not be in agreement with their housemates about it, but once received, the process for that tenancy coming to an end has started. Now, it can be reversed, subject to every single tenant who is named on that tenancy agreeing that they are going to rescind that notice. So the person who just said it, and if they'd had a drink too many one evening and had sent a text message, that does actually count as notice. So we would need to go through a process, or you, the landlord, would need to go through a process of getting every single tenant to agree in writing that that would be rescinded.
Great, thanks, Phil.
So Hannah, sorry, I'm just going to if I may, just dive in with a clarification then, Phil. So thinking about this landlord who's asked this question, I think they've asked it in part because they probably want to go, well, can this, is my reading of this what I think it is? And you've answered, I feel like, the first part, but like, what can they possibly do? I mean, how do you then, what's the advice about how do you manage this practically with people to sort of, mitigate the tenancy ending in November, which is if you're trying to manage to an academic cycle, this seems crazy, right? So what are your options?
Yeah. Previously, the options were quite straightforward and simple. People were in a fixed term contract. They were liable whether they wanted to leave or not. So traditionally, I guess I'll cover off what used to happen in the old world because we can compare to it. A student tenant would potentially ring someone like us up, or they would ring the landlord up and say, I would like to move out. And the response from the landlord typically would be, you're in a fixed term contract. I'm very happy to help you out. If you find a replacement, I will do the paperwork to make sure that the replacement can move in on your behalf and they can start paying the rent that you're liable for instead of you. And that was broadly simply how the sector worked. The difference here certainly is that that tenancy does come to an end. And if you're wanting the remainder of the group to stay, there is a conversation to be had. So dialogue with the tenant is the main thing that you can do in this instant, is picking up the phone to the person who wants to leave, picking up the phone to those who potentially want to stay, and really find out their motivations and understand their situation and what's going on. And so more so than ever, this is not about a legal like steps that you take, but this is a what negotiation do you enter and what skill do you have in order to understand what offers could be made to maintain a group or a part group that are there. Now, at this point, from a legal point of view, there are several splinters that happen, and it can get quite complex. But as an overview, you could choose, for instance, if it was I think there was the question we had was potentially a like 4-bed house and one person wanted to leave. Could the 3 other people remain? They could remain if you agree a new assured periodic tenancy with them. Yes. So in effect, what you would do is sign a new APT agreement with the 3, and it would then be a negotiation as to what rent they're going to pay, right? They're probably not going to pay the 4 persons of rent. They're probably going to pay 3 times the rent. So that might mean that you agree to 75% of the rent level. In theory, you could go back out to market. You could go and try and find 4 new tenants. In practice, of course, in the student market, it's unlikely you're going to do that. And so our advice really here is landlords are going to have to be more understanding than ever before of situations that their student tenants find themselves in. And a lot of the time, the student tenants will look to the landlord to solve it. And the landlord does have some ability to solve it in the sense of agreeing new, maybe lower rent agreements with the tenants. And that's perhaps where we land. And I would welcome if that hasn't quite answered any questions to retype any clarification. We're more than happy to take it and have a look further.
Great, thanks, Phil. We've got someone here that wants to know if they've already got a rolling agreement with no end date, do they need to issue an updated agreement?
Okay, yeah, nice, easy one. So no, you do not, but you just need to make sure you issue the information sheet. So the information sheet is the statutory mechanism for basically changing an AST into an APT. So an assured short-hold tenancy into an assured periodic tenancy. And if you were to Google information sheet and have a look at it, it basically explains that change to the tenant, and that's why a landlord is obligated to give it. No matter what, whether you give it or not, your assured short-hold tenancy will become an APT on the 1st of May. It's a compliance question as to whether you've served the information sheet within a month of then, i.e. by the 31st of May. So nothing to do in that instance other than issue the information sheet compliantly.
Thank you. There's quite a lot of questions around the theme of the information sheet. It seems like there's a bit of worry here about what the best practice is. Should people be posting it? Should they be emailing it? What sort of audit trail do they need to have? Could you maybe provide some more guidance on that?
So try and communicate this really succinctly. There must be an evidence base for having served the information sheet. The possible consequence of not having an evidence base is a £7,000 fine for not doing so. So that's the risk. The evidence base, it would be very similar to if you were posting it. It's very similar to normal evidence-based processes. You would send it from 2 post offices, and you'd do that receipted. And that basically ensures that one of them does arrive. That's in legal terms, if that goes to court, that's seen as having served notice. And that's the practical way to post it. In terms of email, you basically need written agreement that you can serve a notice to that email address. So if you haven't got that inside the tenancy agreement, as we were discussing before, you can come to that agreement over email with your tenant. So you could email your tenant and say, will you please agree that I can give you notices under your assured short hold tenancy via email? And if they reply to you and say yes, then you will then be compliant to actually issue the information sheet to them. The really important thing is there is a technical point here. The PDF must be attached to the email. It must not be a link. It must not be a URL clickable link. It has to be the PDF sheet itself in the email. And just for clarity, so anyone who is our client under our managed service, that is all being done as part of that service. So we are serving that information sheet on all of the tenants. And for absolute clarity, it is every single tenant. So if there's 2 tenants on a tenancy agreement, both of them will get the email.
And Hannah, just before you jump in with a follow-up question, Bill, I just wanted to just mention a couple of clarifications as well, quickly, if I could. The information sheet is a statutory document, and hence why you can't serve your own version of it. It has to be the document. It can't be another third-party version. Now, someone's asked for a copy of it, and Hannah's actually posted a link to it in the chat. So if you're on, or if you want to open the chat, if you haven't already, a link to the actual government website form is there, and that's available for you to use. It's available on government website. I'm just conscious that sometimes searching in Google doesn't necessarily return you the right thing, and you've got to serve the right form. Just on this point of serving via post, you talked about taking it to 2 separate post offices. This is to cover off the idea that it's beyond reasonable doubt that it has ended up going there. It's possible that the postman loses it once, but it would be pretty almost probability wise impossible that it gets lost from 2 different places. However, just to say, don't be tempted to add signed for delivery. If you ask a tenant to sign for it and then they don't, they then haven't actually accepted receipt and haven't actually received the document. If you post it, all you need to do is simply post it by first class, or even second class post is fine. And if you've done that and got the receipt to say that it's been posted, that's what you need to do. Don't be tempted to add signed for, because it sort of feels more formal or important, because of course a tenant could then refuse to sign for a document, and then they haven't actually, you don't actually have the evidence base to say they've ever received it. So I thought just worth clarifying that. But yeah, Hannah, feel free to ask anything else. I think.
Yeah, we've got a question here about there's a landlord who's wanting to potentially sell their property, and they're asking how much notice they will need to give.
Yep. So between now and the end of the month, you can still issue a Section 21 notice. That's caveated. There's some subject to. We would need to understand the fixed term end date that you've currently got, and you'd have to be a certain way into your tenancy already. So there's some questions around that. But at the moment, a Section 21 allows you to issue that in the next week and a half or so, with a couple of months' notice.
I think this is on the assumption that it's periodic at this point.
Yeah.
So.
Post 1st of May, the new process is a full 4 months of notice. But you can't do that within the first 8 months of the tenancy. So if a tenant moved in on the 1st of January, it would be the 1st of September when you could actually issue 4 months of notice to have them move out on January the following year. So really, it takes from someone moving in to you requesting them to move out because you want to, say, sell the property, which is allowed. So under Section 8, just to remind you, that is a ground 1 and 1A. So that's in the law for this. It will be January the following year that you would hopefully then get possession. Of course, we hope that the tenant moves out in accordance with that notice, but it is their choice to take it to court and have it enforced if they did. Now, the critical thing here is, what if you then put it on the market to sell? It doesn't sell. It's really important to know that for 12 months after that tenant haven't moved out, or it's really 16 months from having issued the notice, you cannot ever put it back on the market. You cannot let it out. You cannot put it on Airbnb. You cannot use it for any reason to derive any monetary value out of it whatsoever. There is one very limited circumstance, which is if you are selling it and the person you are selling it to wants to temporarily rent it from you in the run up to them buying it from you, then on that occasion you can rent it. But that is literally it.
And Phil, though, just to clarify here, because it sounds as though in every instance, if you've got a tenant whose property, sorry, you got a tenant in your property and you want to sell it, you're going to be waiting a year. That's not quite the case if, say, for example, they've been a tenant, let's say they've been there for 3 years already. It's then a 4-month notice period, isn't it, in order to say, let them know that you're going to be regaining possession of the property via the Section 8 because you're going to be selling the property.
Yeah, in that case, the headline is, absolutely, that they have already been living in the property for 8 months. You can subsequently serve 4 months of notice.
So that minimum period applies to when you've more recently signed up a new tenant.
Correct.
Yeah. Great. Hopefully that answered that, Hannah.
Yeah, great, thank you. Could you clarify the rules around pets? On what grounds do you think a landlord could refuse a pet request? And how would you recommend dealing with those kind of requests?
I think we should talk about this at the same time, Phil, because it's a good question, and there is not a specific, or there's not a set of specific rules that we can give the listeners an answer to. There's not one place we can say these are the definitive rules about what is reasonable and what is not reasonable. There is some clearly thinking about, well, what was the intention of the law, and there is some clear concepts here, and there's some clear guidance, and I think the starting point really for people to think about is the default assumption really needs to be you should reasonably expect that you should accept the request, in effect, that the tenant should reasonably be allowed a pet, and that should be the starting point. I know that clearly there will be landlords and people who maybe even who are listening who will have had maybe a negative experience as a consequence of a pet being in their property. Now, in my view, in many ways, the legislation that says you can't reasonably refuse somebody's right to have a pet doesn't really change the mechanisms that you have to rectify the problems that you are worried about having. So for the most part, the complaints that we receive, or the concerns that most landlords voice in this space are, it'll leave damage to my property, it will cause damage to my furniture, it might leave hair in the carpets and things like this. And whether the legislation says you can or you can't accept a pet, you have, like Sophie said in the presentation earlier, you have mechanisms to resolve these things. The legislation is clear that the tenant has an obligation to give you back the property in the condition it was given to them, subject to fair wear and tear, and that you have the ability to hold them to that account at the end of the tenancy in the event that they don't. So if a pet or if anyone else damages your property, if a tenant or the dog breaks your sofa, you have a mechanism to charge them to put that right in the event that they don't put that right, through a deposit reclaim. And assuming that you've got a good inventory and you've got a good evidence base for showing what it was like when they moved in, you can hold them to that account when they move out. So the pet's point, in my view, it should be being mostly dealt with through the repairing and the tenant's obligations that exist already in the tenancy, and maybe is a bigger issue than it needs to become. But like Sophie alluded to, I think also, clearly where you've got, say, for example, a shared house that's got shared communal areas, you may have a tenant that has already got severe allergies, for example. It may be impractical to have then someone else have a pet in that house where they have to then access shared spaces. Or similarly, you've got someone's got 3 large dogs. If they're renting a studio flat, that may be problematic, and therefore the main thing is you've got to be in a position where, if it is challenged and raised to the ombudsman, that you have a reasonable that you feel like you can reasonably present a justification for your position on this point. But it is a difficult one, and Phil and I have argued lots about this point because it's not totally clear.
Phil, do you have anything you want to add there before I jump to the next question?
No, Tom has more than covered it. I think broadly, when we look at the spirit of this, ultimately, what the government were trying to do is say yes to pets, and that's fundamentally what they're trying to do, and that's what they've told the electorate. And no one really wants to be the case law on this. So unless there's a very, very good reason, then it looks like it's a mitigation strategy. So what can you put in place in order to make sure that the tenant does what they can to make sure the pet doesn't damage the property?
Great, thank you. We've got someone here who they have a signed AST with an increased rent that's not due to start until the 1st of August. Does that rent essentially stay at its current price, and do they need to reissue the new notice?
Yeah, so I've read this question. I've actually got a subsequent question to try and answer it, and maybe the poster can type this in, and because it could be the case here where they've got an AST already and then they've signed another one. So typically you might have had a fixed term AST and then you've signed another one for the next year. Or interpreting this question, it could be that they've got a fixed term AST and they've already pre-agreed that the rent will increase on the 1st of August. So I'm not sure which of those scenarios it is. It probably does change between those two scenarios. So I'll just cover them both. In effect, when this is a confusing part of it, there's lots of people who actually have two ASTs in existence right now. One for a fixed term that people are currently living in there now, and one to start in a few months' time. Both of those tenancies need the information sheet serving on them. So I would actually be sending the email twice to the tenant to cover both tenancies, and specifically kind of naming one tenancy and naming the second tenancy when sending the information sheet. The second thing is that you would need to give notice on the first tenancy to allow the second tenancy to then start as an APT. So you'd need to go through your notice points. Now, if you did all that, then the increased rent that you've got in that second contract would stand, and that would be fine. If this is the scenario where you've got an AST and you've pre-agreed a rent increase, it's a more interesting one, that in the sense that I think the belt and braces approach is on the 1st of May, you go through the process of issuing Section 13 to the rent level that you desire on the 1st of August. In that scenario, I think that's there would be a debate about whether a pre-agreed rent increase would stand or not. I would take the view that on the 1st of May, all of the clauses in the AST that have already been pre-agreed, of which some of them would have been rent increase clauses, are wiped away when the new legislation comes in. And as a consequence, the only way to raise rent at that point is the Section 13 process. So I would be advocating for following Section 13 with that scenario.
Great. We're coming just a couple of minutes to the end, but we've got one last question. So from the 1st of May, can a landlord refuse a tenant or a couple who aren't working?
So no is the answer. I think as again, Sophie gave us a quick bit of information about this. But in effect, if a couple aren't working, but they have, sorry, it's not the whole story. So if they're not working, then what you need to look at is their affordability and their source of income. And effectively, what the legislation is saying is you can't simply discriminate on the basis of someone's source of income. So if somebody is in receipt of benefits that might be £40,000 a year or £30,000 a year because of the particular benefits that they receive, that source of income has to be looked at in the same way as anyone else's source of income. If someone else's source of income is a job, and someone's source of income is benefits, you can't simply say, well, I don't want to accept this person on the basis that their source of income is benefits as opposed to somebody whose source of income is a job. What you can discriminate on is the affordability point. So you can still run affordability checks to say, is this property that this person is applying to rent, is it affordable to them? So And we do that at this point already. So when a tenant comes to apply for a property, one of the things that you want to try and make sure that you get right is to say, given their declared source of income, wherever it comes from, can they reasonably afford to rent this property? Will it put them in financial, difficulties if we sign a tenancy? Because that's obviously the sort of situation that you want to avoid. So no, you can't discriminate simply on the basis of the source of income. You still obviously have mechanisms for being able to ensure that you select tenants, the right tenant for your property. And I think that's probably something that maybe we've is worth just reiterating as well. That tenant selection at the very start of the tenancy, given what is changing, is really important, and it's why more than ever, understanding, getting good previous landlord references, understanding where tenants have previously lived, having suitable guarantors if that if so requires, and having and understanding people's source of income and their affordability is all key to making sure that you have a real successful let, and landlord and tenant obligations are aligned. So hopefully that's answered that.
Yeah, that's all our questions answered. Thank you.
Wonderful. Sorry, go on, Phil.
Yeah, sorry, there was just one question that I saw to provide clarity on, and this is this case where you've got two contracts, an AST now and another fixed AST coming, and there was a question about, can they give 2 months notice on like a future dated tenancy? So for instance, I've agreed someone's going to move in on the 1st of August in my property this year. It's already a signed tenancy. Can they give me 2 months notice today? And the answer to that question is no, they cannot. The 2 months notice applies to when they are in tenancy itself. So someone could tell you that they don't intend to move in on the 1st of August, but that is different to giving you 2 months notice under the statutory grounds. In that scenario, a tenant really is still responsible for mitigating your losses as a landlord for having to find a new replacement tenant in effect. They could, of course, move in and then give 2 months notice if they intended to do that. But this idea that a future agreement that you've got could just be wiped out by a tenant given 2 months notice, that's not correct. So that's a positive for a landlord's point of view.
Great. Well, thank you ever so much. We sadly have come to the end of the time that we have allotted. We're keen not to keep you any later, and we just wanted to say, a massive thank you for all of you that have joined. It's been it's been really good to see so much interaction and so many conversations and questions come in. As I said, we're going to make available to anyone who has come the slide deck that Sophie's taken us through, along with a copy of this presentation. So hopefully, if there's any bits that you wanted to re-watch or check, then you'll be able to do that. Also, as we've said, as Sophie said right at the start, we are Comfort Estates. We have an office here. We've got a team of 30 staff in Nottingham. We will be open again in the morning tomorrow. We do like having these conversations, and whether you're a current client landlord, whether you are dipping your toe in the water and thinking about, is management right for me, or even if you just simply want to debate renters' rights, Phil will make himself available until the cows come home to talk about the technicalities of these things. It's something that we enjoy doing. So hopefully it's been useful. And we just, as I said, want to say a big thanks. So we are going to dial off now, and just say that, wish you a very good evening, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye for now.
Bye.